Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Can everyone hear in the back of the room? We were joking ahead of time because I have a thing about Tennessee. Tennessee produces more good politicians per capita than any country, any state in the country. I mean, Estes Kefauver and Al Gore on the Democratic side, Howard Baker, Bill Brock, and now Bob Corker and Lamar Alexander. My poor state, grew up in Pennsylvania. We haven't had a national politician since James Buchanan, and that didn't end very well. So we are terribly envious of Tennessee, and Bob's background, which was just cited, a successful politician, a successful businessman, the trip to Haiti with your church when you were in your 20s, I really think explains a lot of why he is one of the really crucial people in the United States Senate. If the Senate works, and that's a huge if, I'm not sure it will, I'm not sure it's going to, I'm not sure it has, but if it works, Bob Corker will be one of the central figures in making it work. Bob, let's start off. We've got a lot of foreign policy questions to get to, and I know there's a lot of good questions out there, but let me just start with what's in the news this week about this surveillance thing. But just to back up for a second, if I'm right, if I've read the papers correctly, there is this 20-something-year-old person, Mr. Snowden, who didn't go to college, who got a job at the NSA as a security guard, I believe, which of course immediately attracted the CIA, who hired him to be and give him top secret clearance and sent him to Geneva. And he then comes back and he gets hired by Booz Allen and gets sent to Hawaii to make $200,000 a year with access to top secret information. That may be the American dream, but also there's something wrong with this picture, apart from whether he did was right, wrong, criminal, or not. I mean, doesn't this raise serious questions about the CIA and the NSA?
Well, there's no doubt a lot of upward mobility. I think it speaks to the fact that, you know, this area of activity has tremendous growth, has seen tremendous growth, has seen tremendous funding. And I think people of certain skills, if you will, whether he had them or not, obviously are highly sought after. But no, I think it creates, there'll be a lot more oversight, I think, from the Senate Intelligence Committee. I think people are well aware that that is the thing that's going to protect civil liberties in our country, but also ensure the integrity of what we're doing. And I thought we had a really good hearing on Thursday after this occurred. I wrote a letter to the president and just asked that someone come explain exactly what has happened. To their credit, they immediately had some hearings in the Senate Intelligence Committee, and it was evident to me that even some of the Intelligence Committee members were not fully aware of all the activities that were occurring, which made me a little bit nervous. But look, I was well aware personally of the PRISM effort, knew a lot of details about that. We had a very extensive discussion when we did some expansions of what we're doing in that regard. The more broad-based effort I was not aware of. And at the same time, once I heard the explanations of how it's being conducted, it made me feel a lot more comfortable with all of the activities. But at the same time, it's going to take tremendous oversight and certainly a lot of policing to ensure that these things don't get out of hand. We don't end up with a lot of rogue activities.
Can there be more transparency? This president promised transparency back in 2008, either hasn't been able or hasn't delivered on a lot of it. Is that impossible in this area, or should the public know more about what's going on?
I think actually in this case, first of all, there's been a lot of transparency over the last week, right?
That's true.
So the Guardian has really made things very transparent. I think that look, the people that we are defending against are, I'm sure, well aware that these activities are taking place, and how we do them, it is a shame that things have gone to the extent they have from the standpoint of people understanding what's occurring in detail. But I do think, yes, discussions like this are important for this democracy. They're important for our country to have. And so, yes, sir, I do think that having much greater transparency would be good. I think debates of all kinds relative to how we're going to deal with security, but how we're going to deal with foreign policy, we really haven't had those debates. I welcome a debate, for instance, on the AUMF. I think that's something that our nation should debate. We rely upon today a 60-word authorization for the use of military force that was put in place on September the 18th, 2011. Any trip through northern Africa today would say to any of you, I think, that there's a very thin thread between that AUMF and the activities that we're going to carry out in the world. And so, yes, I think transparency, openness, debate on all these issues, especially now, is very important to our nation.
Would it be your inclination to expand the authority of the of that act, or to narrow it?
I think both. I mean, the AUMF was created around a specific effort.
Supposed to be related to Al-Qaeda, basically, isn't there? Anyone who attacks the United States.
But I think that, again, if you talk with almost any of our leaders conducting operations, I mean, things are very, very different today. And I think in some cases it should be expanded, and in some cases it should be narrowed. What I would hate to do, and I've been saying this from day one, I mean, our leader here today, the CEO, talked about, I'm glad he said, a Republican perspective. I mean, it'd be hard to know today what the Republican perspective is. I'm on the Foreign Relations Committee, as you know, and I think most of you know that one of the reasons as such a young senator, I'm the ranking member on Foreign Relations, is that no Republican wants to be on the Foreign Relations Committee, right? So it's a way to end your career prematurely. And if you look at just the makeup of our committee, you look down the dais, and one of the most junior members is John McCain, who came on the committee after losing his ranking position on armed services, although he still serves there, and Rand Paul. And so you look at that, it's a pretty bipolar view of the world, right? And so I think when you have a debate like this, when you open up possibly the AUMF and discuss it, you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that's not going to harm our national interest. And you're not going to end up in a place where you end up in a quagmire. So I think before you ever begin that debate, you have some hearings and see if there are some places where such diversity can come together. But yeah, I think we ought to have that debate, and I think in some cases it ought to be expanded, in some cases narrowed.
Senator, the administration is on the verge of deciding, apparently this time for real, whether they're going to come to the aid of the Syrian as insurgents or not. You wrote a letter to the president this week urging him to do so. What are your hopes as to what could be achieved there, and what are your fears?
Yeah, well, I hope that over the next few days, the White House is going to embark on the strategy that was laid out in the Foreign Relations Committee on a 15-3 vote, which again, if you look up at the makeup of our committee on both sides, pretty big, that's a lot of consensus making when you're talking about arming rebels in Syria, which is what this does. I think if you look at where we were when this began, the president lays out, it makes a statement, Assad must go. Not to be critical, but not much happened after that. It was a statement, but it was when a statement is made by the United States of America, there's something that affects the world, and yet, we didn't really take much activity. We have more going on there than I think meets the eye, but we're not involved in the real way, and we're the only country that has the ability to really bring the neighboring countries and others together around any kind of coherent strategy. We are the only nation in the world that has that capacity. So what's happened over the last 27, 28 months is Assad is still there, and while that might have been of some level of interest to our nation, what is of great national interest now is going to be the aftermath of Assad and the second war that's taking place there now, where you've got probably 100,000 opposition folks on the ground. They're divided, not distinctly, but generally divided into two groups. You have one that's made up of about 6,000 hardened fighters that have called themselves al-Nusra. They've affiliated with Al-Qaeda. They are the best fighters in the country. They're making the most gains in the country as opposition groups. They are the best at delivering humanitarian aid, and they actually have a real command and control. The rest of the group is made up mostly of, folks like us. In other words, You know, you had an administration, a regime that was harming their villages. They took up arms. Maybe you would take your neighborhood, I would take my neighborhood. There is no command and control. These are people who want to see, generally speaking, a different Syria emerge. Generally speaking, I don't want to be overstating here, they would be the most apt to have a pluralistic government. Generally speaking, those are the folks that would be most apt to reach out to the Alawite population, which is 10% of the country, and by the way, Christians, that support Assad. And they support Assad because they're worried about being exterminated when this is over, if he falls. And so to me, what we should be thinking about is the day after Assad, what we should be doing is organizing these more pluralistic, open-minded, more secular, and again, don't let me take those statements too far, none of you do the same, but they're most apt to cause the country to be a very different country than it would be if al-Nusra and others take control. So we have to change the balance of power. I think the negotiated settlement at the end is our best outcome. To change that balance inside the country, I do believe we should train, we should arm, and we have very strict vetting requirements in the bill regarding that, especially as it relates to anything resembling man pads or anything else. Matter of fact, there's a whole other level. Helping them with humanitarian aid, helping them, train them with command and control. And I think if we can help shift that balance, again, by not having boots on the ground, no boots on the ground, but helping them in that way, I think we have a much greater opportunity for a negotiated exit, especially if Russia sees that occurring. We do need to take into account their regional interests. They have a naval port there that's important to them. They want to have influence in the region, and I think we need to understand that. But I do believe this is the very best way forward, and if I had to make a bet today, I believe that's what the administration is going to do over the next very short period of time, and I think that would be good for our nation from our national interest standpoint. If you look at, I know that many people in this room, this is a very esteemed group of folks, and I know many of you have traveled to the region, but you go to Jordan right now, 25% of the population there are folks who have streamed in from Syria, and it's destabilizing Jordan. You look at all the countries, all of you know this, that Syria touches, and it's going to have a tremendously destabilizing effect if this continues as it is. We have the ability to convene the neighborhood. We have the ability to push this ahead in a very different way without having boots on the ground. I think it absolutely is in our nation's national interest and in the world's interest to not see that country further destabilized. So I think we did a really good thing in our committee. I hope the administration will follow suit. I think there are many there that want to see this happen, and I think it's going to happen.
Let me just follow that up with one question. I think very few, almost no one would disagree with your analysis of Syria and Assad and the terrible tragedies that are occurring there. Over the last 30 years, we have intervened in different ways in 3 different predominantly Muslim countries, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya.
Right.
I think very few people would argue the outcomes today are very satisfactory. We got rid of bad guys, to be sure. Why will it be different this time?
Well, I think I think in this case, you do have to guard against mission creep. And that's why we have people on our committee, and I think you probably know full well who they are, that want to see us involved right now in a no-fly zone. I think once you begin that type of activity, you easily move into a mission creep. And I don't want to see that happen. So I think there are ways for us to show influence. Let me just tell you, you know, you sit down, I've sat down, as I know many in the room, I'm sure have, with some of the Free Syrian rebels. And, you know, they say, Corker, look, you know, these goggles y'all are sending are nice, and, you know, these vests are pretty cool. But, you know, at the end of the day, Al, I really do think it's important. It's almost becoming symbolic, the lethal aid. I think it's are you going to be involved in helping us move ahead and change the balance or not? I think there is a way for us to do that. I think the bill is very articulate as to the way it lays that out. I think the administration, with all of their resources, can do an even better job, I'm sure, than what we've laid out. But I think there is a way for us to show influence in the region to help change the balance without us having the concerns of being involved in something that escalates to another level.
Senator, let's talk about the pivot to Asia. And what is you talk to people, you get briefings. What is your assessment, your early assessment of the Sunnyland conference last weekend?
Well, I had a brief conversation with Kerry when he was leaving. Yeah, she sounded exhausted. I think we're going to get together in the next few days and talk about it more fully, and I'll speak more to just the public readouts than I will our conversation. I didn't think it ended up being as substantive as you know, it might have been, but I was very glad that it occurred. And I think, let's face it, our relationship with China over the next several decades, I think most people in the room would agree, is going to be the most important relationship that we have in the world. So I'm all for the President and our Secretary of State having these types of meetings. It really, you know, if you look at China, it speaks to foreign policy, American foreign policy. It almost symbolizes more than anything else the complexities we now have. I mean, the world is so different. I mean, there are people in this room that are scholars that, you know, were very involved with our relationship to the Soviet Union, and that was kind of, you know, kind of the relationship that sort of defined the world for decades. The relationship with China is very complex, right? I mean, you know, on one hand, we view it as a place that is a competitor in many ways. Economically, we see them, you know, flexing. I was just in China. I made a trip to South Korea, Japan, and China right at the time all three of them changed leadership. It's really a remarkable time in that part of the world. And you see them flexing their muscles in the South and East China Seas, just sort of pushing the envelope. At the same time, with the urbanization that's occurring there, tremendous market for the United States over time, tremendous export market. So, and then we have the issue of North Korea. They're the only country in the world, really, that can help change that dynamic. And I think it's evident, Al, that over the last month, 6 weeks, China has been playing a different role, thankfully, in North Korea. And we've seen some degree of at least some behavior change, which they are the country that can make that happen. So our relationship is incredibly complex. At the same time, they're ripping our companies off, stealing trillions of dollars in value from this country through intellectual, and doing the same with others. I was at a Munich security conference, and we met with the leading businesses while I was there. They have the same concerns. I mean, any company that thinks they haven't you know, been affected in some way by them, that's a large company, basically probably doesn't know what's happening within their own company because they are so prolific. So very complex. I think it's hard to probably, with the Chinese, just by nature, to develop a warm and fuzzy in the first meeting. Okay, I mean, it's just not quite the way things go, and I think that's kind of the way this one went. Mm-hmm. It wasn't so warm and fuzzy, mm-hmm. Okay. But I think it's a beginning, and I think it's something that, as a nation, for our own interest, our own national interest and the world interest, we need to spend a tremendous amount of time developing that relationship and understanding. So it's going to be good for us and the standard of living for people in Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and all across the country. And it's going to be very important to the world that that relationship is a healthy one, even as complex as it is.
Senator, you say they've been helpful in North Korea in the last month or so. Put yourself in the Chinese shoes for a second and look at North Korea. They know that it's a pretty crazy regime by their standards. They also don't want it to collapse. They don't want the refugees. They don't want an America, Korea, a unified Korea, Japan competition there. So how do you think the Chinese calculate right now as far as the North Koreans are concerned?
I think that North Korea got about one tick over the line, and I think China, you know, certainly, you know, if you talk to Chinese officials, and again, many people in the room have, stability is the thing. You know, over time, if you don't poke at something, it'll resolve itself. You know, stability is the key word, especially with all the changes that are taking place within the country. That is their major concern. And you're right, a little 20 million person country on the border that's poor, that has, by the way, a lot of U.S. soldiers below the DMZ, is something that they don't want to see continued on up against their border. But I think this last go-around got their attention. I think we were very helpful, and I think Senator Kerry, by the way, or excuse me, Secretary Kerry did a really good job of raising this issue with them. And I think from their perspective, they now realize it's getting to a level where it's going to create problems. I don't think they want to see us. I mean, look, our allies. You know, the biggest concern, I'm going to digress slightly, when you meet with our allies, Japan, South Korea, is really our fiscal situation, right? I mean, what they're concerned about, hey, you guys are our friends, but are you going to be able to afford to be our friends anymore? And I cannot overstate how that is actually, from the standpoint of foreign policy, our biggest issue right now is our fiscal situation. Many of the Chinese leaders view us as a nation in decline, but that being said, I don't think that it's in China's interest to see us continue to bulk up as it relates to dealing with nuclear threats in that part of the world. I think it's in their interest to really tone this down and to try to facilitate less bellicose actions by North Korea.
This is, as you said, a very knowledgeable and well-versed audience, and I know we have some questions for Senator Corker out there. Do we have someone with microphones? And if you ask a question, would you mind identifying yourself? Right there in the second row.
Thank you. Good morning, Senator.
Thank you.
Don Lauren, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Security in the Bush II administration. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for your comments. The whole nature of the conference today is the future of national security, looking forward, and America's role.
Right.
A key factor in that, in my opinion, is our participation in the ever-changing Arctic. You're in a key position. What do we need to do to ratify the Law of the Sea Convention so that we can take our rightful leadership role in dealing in those issues?
Well, the way the Constitution reads, that means you need 67 votes. So what I would say is, you know, the thing that needs to happen there is a case needs to be made for the treaty. You know, we had some hearings this last year. I'm open to looking at it. I do have some concerns. The hearings we had really were pretty low level. I mean, you know, there were a few big companies that were affected, you know, and that was basically, I think, to appeal to Republicans. Let's face it, Republicans have been more resistant to this, even though you obviously are one and support it. But Republicans, you know, Republicans, I think to try to appeal to Republican interest, it was approached from a sort of a commercial side, that this would be good for certain companies, this would be good for big oil. And I don't think some of the concerns about sovereignty were addressed in an appropriate way. So I think the best way for those who advocate for the Law of the Sea Treaty to see it come to fruition is to really, you know, explain more fully what's happening in the Arctic. I hope to make a trip there in the near future to see what's occurring in that regard. But in addition to that, you know, appeal to a broader sense of national security and that kind of thing. But the case for the Law of the Sea Treaty has been very poorly made. And you know, when you talk to some of the CEOs who came up and testified, they say, you know, matter of fact, this is a big issue. You ask them about it, and they say, well, you know, I was asked by X and X to come up here and testify. On my list of 10 things that I care about, it's number 9. So there just hasn't been a real focus on explaining the importance of it. And you know, as in this world today, treaties have become a little bit more of concern, let's face it. And I think a pretty good effort took place, by the way, 3 or 4 years ago. It was a much better effort from my standpoint, where we did have members of our national security. By the way, when you were hanging around, I guess, under Bush too, I guess you were hanging around during that time. There was a much better case made the first effort than there was the second effort. So again, I think you got to appeal to people's broader sensibilities about it being in our national interest, not good for Exxon or some other. Yeah.
We have some. I see a hand there, second row, third row.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Jeannie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I followed the first question, and I've heard your answer that the hearing last year in May and June of 2012 was at a low level. I understood that...
You agree it was low level?
I'm sorry?
You agreed that it was low level. Is that what you're saying?
You said so. You made the mention.
Yeah.
And I understood that Secretary Clinton did participate in the hearing. Ambassador and Secretary Negroponte did present his case on the hearing. And Mr. Bellinger did present his case in the hearing. And I think all of those hearings answer directly to the concerns of sovereignty, national sovereignty. But my question to you has to go with what the statement you made, that all of our posture to our allies actually has come down to the fiscal issue. It both for us and for how they perceive us, the perception is a fiscal issue.
Right.
So what do you think the steps that we can count on the Republicans in the sequestration questions? Is there anything that we can do to reduce that impact of sequestration, both domestically and foreign relations?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. I will say that you're right, back to the first, the law of the sea, that there were some good questions asked. It was a very evident lack of passion for the issue by the Secretary of State at the time. I mean, it was really there hasn't been an appropriate effort put place yet, and maybe there will be, on the issue of the fiscal issues. Today it was reported in the paper, and it's true, that Dennis Madonna was up on the Hill yesterday, and for what it's worth, as a chief of staff for this president, he really is a breath of fresh air. There has been actual conversations taking place between the White House and senators. There were these dinners that took place. More widely covered, I think, than any national issue ever was the president having dinner with 12 senators, and which is amazing. And I think it speaks to sort of the first term and a little bit of a different approach this time. So the relationship piece is much better. At the end of the day, it's the policies, right? I mean, we've got to figure out a way to meld together two very competing interests as it relates to how we deal with these fiscal issues. I had hoped the sequester would actually create an environment where, you create some intensity to do the things that we need to do. Let's face it, at the end of the day, it's all entitlements. It really is. I mean, when the average American family today is paying into Medicare over their lifetime in today's dollars, $119,000, including what the employer pays on their behalf, and the average American family today is taking out of Medicare in today's dollars $357,000, especially with this incredibly esteemed group, that is a problem, okay? And so, we've got over the next 10 years, 20 million more families coming on the same formula. The gap continues to widen between what's going in and what's coming out. And truly, it is the issue that we have to have the courage to deal with. So to me, it's entitlement reform linked to revenues through tax reform. I've been saying that from day one, and to me, that's heresy for me to say, but to me, that's what needs to be done. And if we can deal with these two issues, then we take the pressure off of our domestic spending, which is only, or our what we might call non-mandatory spending, which is only a third of what we spend. So, you know, it candidly is, it's all about that. It's the biggest generational theft that's ever occurred in our nation's history, where we're transferring wealth from the younger generation to the older generation. So on moral grounds, it's wrong. From the standpoint of our standing in the world, it's wrong. It's lessening because of sequester. I mean, who would have thought that 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats put in a room together could not find $1.2 trillion in reductions over the next 10 years when we're going to spend $47 trillion of your money? I mean, who would have thought? But we didn't. And so I do hope the next line is in October. I do hope we're going to have a little bit more intensity. I go back to the law of the sea. There's no intensity around law of the sea. Zero. There's only slightly more than that on the fiscal issue right now. We need to have a little bit more intensity around the issue and focus. I do think there's been some foreplay here, okay, that you know, could possibly lead to something, but I'm beginning to question candidly, with revenues coming in more, with deficits dropping, let's face it, unfortunately politicians think short term. I'm worried about whether we're going to have that intensity. As one senator, I'm going to do everything I can to create a situation where we do the things we need to do. I think more than anything else for our economy, by putting this mostly in the rearview mirror, we can cause our economy to be unleashed. And then over time it becomes even lesser of an issue. But that's the way we deal with the sequester, is dealing with the other long-term issues, because you know, there's almost, you know, the sequester is going to stay in place, in my opinion, until we do the 2 things I just mentioned.
I've been accused by some in Senator Corker's party of not being able to go to my right, so I want to go to the right here. And there must be a question on this side, and I'm looking at right there.
Thank you. Hello, Christine Vargas from Addisant. I'd like to ask a question concerning the next 10 to 20 years. What's the best case scenario for China in regards to North Korea? It's infrastructure poor. About 40% of its population is malnourished. They can't work very well. So if they implode, it's a high probability China's not going to want to fit the whole bill. So if they don't want to pay for what that is on their border, who are they going to want to partner with? How do they want that partnership to look? Or do they just want to maintain the status quo and will do anything pressure-wise and subtly to keep North Korea pretty much doing what it's doing, which isn't very helpful to the rest of us?
I don't know that I've ever thought, thank you for the question, I don't know that I've ever thought of it as being something that is a financial issue to China. I don't think that's it. I mean, it's a very small country. It's a comma, if you will, as it relates to the issues that China's dealing with internally with 1.4 billion people. I do think one of the partners, President Park, for what it's worth, in South Korea, has a very different posture towards North Korea right now. And you know, South Korea, it's interesting, you know, they kind of hang around up under our skirt in many ways as it relates to security issues. On the other hand, you know, China, from the standpoint of their economic evolution, is far more important to them. So I think they have a much better partner now in President Park in South Korea than they've had in the past. And obviously, we're going to be their partner in that regard. But I don't look at it as something relative to money. I mean, it really is. You go back to the bottom line. To me, with Chinese leaders, it's about stability, and I think it's finding a way for North Korea to have some type of less bellicose arrangement than they now have, less threatening arrangement. I think the unification efforts in South Korea are going to be stepped up. It's a shame that today's summit over, sounds like silly issues, ended up not taking place. But I really don't look at it as an issue that has a lot to do with finances. It more has to do with with dynamics in the region. What they don't want to see happen, I know, is to have, U.S. soldiers right there on their border, and I think there's ways of dealing with that, and I think it's one of the areas where we could, with their increased involvement, actually come to some solution over time.
Senator, this conference is about security, and one issue that does affect security as well as economics and politics and social issues is immigration. It's on the Senate floor right now.
Yeah.
What's going to happen, and how are you going to vote, and how are you going to vote on that so-called Cornyn Amendment, which Democrats say would be a killer on their border security? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I thought I'd just ask you.
That's fine. So look, I want to vote for an immigration bill. I want to be able to go back to Tennessee, and I'm sure the senators from Pennsylvania want to be able to go back to Pennsylvania and say that, we voted for this immigration bill, and we really do believe that in voting and passing this, we've really solved this problem. We may have some issues down the road, but the notion of having a third wave, an activity, a situation where we wake up in 15 or 20 years and you've got another 10 or 12 million people in our country undocumented, we've solved that problem mostly. We know we're going to have to do a few things, but we think we've solved it. I think at present, in fairness, the way the bill reads, in 120 days, the folks who are in our country who come out of the shadows become what's called RPIs. In other words, they're legal, and I understand that provision. But the trigger for that, Al, is that the Department of Homeland Security has produced a plan to deal with our borders. Now, I don't want to be offensive to anybody, but if you can imagine me landing in the airport in Nashville and telling people that, yes, I voted for a bill that solved our problem, and they say, well, how? Well, because the Department of Homeland Security is going to produce a plan. So you can imagine how some people might say, well, what's that got to do with it? So, I think we do, in fairness, I think, people want this problem solved. And I think when you really look at it, it's I applaud the efforts of all 8 of the senators involved, I really do. And I'm going to tell you this, I really want to vote for an immigration bill that solves the problem. And so whether it's the Cornyn effort, and we actually ourselves also are trying to figure out what is that place, what is that sweet spot, Al, that solves the problem with Democratic sensibilities and solves the problem from a Republican sensibility standpoint. And for what it's worth, I think we're going to get there. Mm-hmm. I do. I don't understand what it was about the negotiations that made the Cornyn Amendment a poison pill, for what it's worth. I really don't. But I understand that's what's being said. And so what I hope is that over the course of the next couple of weeks, not at the end of the debate after things have hardened, but over the course of the next couple of weeks, I hope we're going to find that rub that says, so I can go back in Chattanooga or Nashville or some other place and say, yes, look, I realize that there are a lot of people that are unhappy with this legislation. I realize that, in fairness, the penalties aren't that stiff for people who've come here in an undocumented way. But we've dealt with it in a way that keeps our country competitive. And I really do think, by the way, we've put in place those requirements that are going to keep this from happening again. I don't think we've done that yet. I think we will do that, or I hope we're going to do that. And that is an area where we are spending inordinate amounts of time right now to try to come up with the right mix. And I think we're going to get there. But we haven't yet. And I candidly don't find I don't really know that I even understand what's so offensive about the Cornyn Amendment. I don't really. I'm just being honest. I've gone through it in detail. I don't understand the problem. But if that's the problem, let's get at it another way.
We have time, I think, for right in the back there, standing up, the microphone. Good.
Good morning, Senator. My name is Georgina Tosco. I'm a serviceman in the U.S. Navy. I was actually hoping to inquire about the process of communication sort of in the intelligence community You spoke about it a bit earlier, but I was just going to ask you if there's a way to better the relationship between the policymaker and just the intelligence community or other communities that sort of have the same mission to rectify shortcomings, like structurally or in judgment or in process. And if you could just comment a bit on that. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm doing 3 of these types of things today, and that's very unusual. We spend most of our time on campus, working to try to solve problems. But, one of the things that we thought about today was some of what you said, and we know that we passed a piece of legislation out of the Senate relative to Syria, and some people criticized us for saying that the administration should be doing that, Congress shouldn't. I disagree with that, obviously, very strongly, but I think there's been way too little sort of joint interaction on many of these issues. So what I would say to you is I think there are too few people in the Senate and in the House that are even aware of much that's happening in the intelligence community and other places. And by the way, I understand. I mean, what people are worried about is leaks, right? I mean, you tell a senator something and they go talk to Al Hunt, and then Al broadcast it, and it's so
It's called the American way.
Yes. So I think that I do think one of the solutions, because the hearing that we had last Thursday was outstanding. I read about the fact that about our phone records, and because I'm totally unaware of what's occurred, I'm not on the Intelligence Committee. I know of the more detailed, more important program, but I don't know of this one. And immediately flags go up. You go sit in a hearing, you listen to our intelligence professionals in a classified setting, and you leave there going, as long as we have good oversight, and we're making sure there's no rogue operations that are underway, this is an interesting way to detect some patterns, okay? So I just think that, again, I think the way that we all move towards the same end is all of us being a little bit more involved in the policy setting. And I do think, in fairness, on your side of the equation, I think a little bit more of an outreach from the intelligence community to people on the Hill, and a little more openness in that regard. And again, I understand full well why you'd want to have as little to do with elected members of Congress as possible if you're in that position. But it is important over time to have a national consensus on where we're heading in that regard.
We have time for one more question. I don't want to put pressure on anyone, but I know someone out there has an absolutely fabulous, there's somebody pointing over there, right? Is there a question? I see a hand up over there.
Morning, Senator. My name's Rick Rohn. I'm an Army officer serving in OSD policy. I wanted to go back to your comments about AUMF and, to some extent, Syria. Undersecretary Work started out talking about how long we've been at war, with the important caveat that we've never had a declaration of war.
Right.
Which has allowed, from some of our perspectives, the burdens to be placed disproportionately on certain populations. The military and some members of departments and agencies, and then on future generations in terms of finances. My question is there a modern day role for the congressional responsibility to declare war? And if so, and it hasn't applied to the war on Al-Qaeda, or Afghanistan, or Iraq, or Libya, or possibly Syria, when would it apply?
Yeah.
That was a pretty good last question, Senator.
So we have an opening on our staff. You are saying, look, let's face it, folks. I mean, I look around this room. I know of many of your backgrounds. I'm a guy who built shopping centers around our country. I started in the construction business when I was 25 with $8 grand and built a great company and built several others after that. I arrived in the Senate in 2007. I'm planted on the Foreign Relations Committee, candidly, because of my lack of background in that area. I mean, I know about economics and banking, and I know about the kind of things that drive our economy, but I'm lesser familiar with some of the foreign relations issues, so I come on this committee. I wake up 6 years later, and I'm the ranking member, and I've done a lot of travel privately. I don't make a big deal about it. I've been to a lot of yucky places, which is mostly where our problems are. I don't have the experience that many of you have, but what I do know is that what this young man just said is dead on. I mean, the Foreign Relations Committee, we've had some really knowledgeable folks who've headed the committee. They've allowed it to be totally feckless. Totally feckless. It's a dereliction of duty. It's not responsible for Congress to not play the role that Congress should play as it relates to issues of importance to our country and to the world. And we're doing everything we can to change that. And that's why we brought up the issue of the AUMF. We think it should be debated by Congress, and we should handle it responsibly. That's why we pushed to pass a bill out of Congress relative to Syria. Al and I had dinner a few weeks ago, and he was giving me a rougher time than he did today about that. And I appreciate you toning down some, by the way.
Big difference between mornings and evenings.
that what you have just said is dead on. I mean, Congress should take the responsibility to play a much more significant and important role as it relates to the deployment of men and women in uniform and everything else relative to foreign policy. And if I have my way, I'm the ranking member, not the chairman, but if I have my way, that's exactly what's going to happen. And I can't think of a better way for me to leave the stage. So thank you very much. Okay, I appreciate it.
I want to... 15 seconds. I have never met a senator who doesn't both respect and like Bob Corker, and you can't say that about very many members of that institution. Yeah. So I think we can see why today. Thank you.
Thank you.